All right, welcome in, folks. I hope you've all had a wonderful start to your morning for this Wednesday. But for the format of this talk, we're really looking at a 10 to 15 minutes career talk from Brandon, and then we'll open up the floor for audience questions. And you're welcome to drop your questions into chat. And Brandon, if you have chat open and you want to address them at that moment, feel free to. If not, we can circle back to them. I'll collect a list of them so that way we have them at the end. I also have some questions from our RSVP, which I'll share at the end if it's a little bit more quiet. After Brandon does share his story, his career trajectory, this is an informal talk, so feel free to use the hand raised feature, unmute yourself, ask your questions. This is a time for you to get connected as well, or I can read from the chat if you're feeling a little shy. So without further ado, then I can go ahead and introduce our speaker. Our speaker today is Brandon Santiago. He is a scientist with a PhD in analytical chemistry, and he specializes in ion mobility and mass spec, types of methods and validation, instrument design, troubleshooting, just to list a few of his expertise. And in particular, he has expertise in bioanalysis and quantification of small molecules. He uses his knowledge at GSK, a pharmaceutical manufacturer company. And today his talk will really feature his career, his lessons learned, the difference between the research investigation and questions there versus industry, and advice on how others can achieve what he has achieved, as well as some of the GSK internship opportunities readily at hand. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and stop my share. I'll pass it to Brandon to go ahead and take us off on his career journey.
Thanks, Joanne, and I appreciate that. And please do interrupt me. Do not let me be up here for 15 minutes sounding like the old guy who says, like, back in my day, this is what we did. So I really implore you guys to interrupt me. So as Joanne mentioned, so I got my PhD in analytical chemistry. I did that at UNC Chapel Hill, so in North Carolina, before transitioning over to a role at GSK. So I've been in a few different roles here. So just wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about that, a little bit about, kind of my trajectory has been, things that I've worked on, things that I think are important, and then hopefully, highlight some of the roles that we have for students or folks in their PhD, finishing their PhD within GSK, and then also specifically within our drug metabolism pharmacokinetics DMPK group, and then answer any questions. So again, really want to keep it informal. Please interrupt me. I don't know if I'll be able to see the hands, Joanne, so if someone throws a hand up, um, just let me know. All right, awesome. Yeah, so Joanne's stealing my slide there from me. So some of these things have been intentional. Some have been, I would say, phrased as accidental. Others sometimes you get to choose, sometimes you don't, both, from a business perspective, or, what projects you might be working on, that kind of thing. But I think the biggest aspect, or maybe one of the strengths that I've had over kind of the past 15 years, is trying to make the most of those. So give you guys a little bit of a walk down through those kind of three aspects of my academic career and then into GSK. But before I do that, what I wanted to make sure I did, hopefully this slide progresses forward, was I think there's kind of three things that I think apply no matter what you do. Three things that apply. I think the first one is this idea that I don't know that I appreciated it in undergrad, and maybe started to figure it out in graduate school, and then here at GSK. It's like, ultimately you have to make decisions about what you're researching, what work you're working on, and the relationships around you, and that looks different in different scenarios. Like sometimes that might mean that you get to make decisions for an entire team. Sometimes it makes decisions around what experiments you're doing, and then sometimes it doesn't feel like you have very much control, but there's things in that scenario that you can control, and putting your best foot forward, and kind of helping drive you to kind of where you want to be. So always kind of being on the lookout, whatever scenario or situation that you're in, is like, what do I own? What aspects of this can I control? And what's going to help me kind of move in the direction that I want to be in? The second one, and I think this kind of really applies when I transitioned from graduate school into GSK, was like, you finish your PhD and you take this big breath and you're like, whew, okay, I've made it. And you're like, you just want to kind of not coast, but you kind of want to be in it for a little bit. You don't want to be having to make decisions about what's next. big career ideas, but it doesn't really stop. Like that development never really ceases. You've got to continue to be ready for kind of what the next step is, because sometimes it comes sooner than you think it's going to be. And so you've kind of always got to be working on your craft, be working on what you've got coming next, and just be ready for that kind of continuous evolution. You as a scientist, you as a leader, whatever that might be. And then the last one that I think everyone hears, and no one really likes it as much as we want to, but like networking is important, and who you know is critical to how this is going to transpire for you, whether or not you stay in academia, whether or not you move into industry. But the one twist that I think I would put on it, and I'll kind of harp on this at kind of each of my career stops, is this idea that networking at a conference where you meet and greet or have drinks with someone is one thing, but it's a whole nother thing to have relationships with people where they're going to put their name and their reputation kind of on the line for you. I think that's a real network and a meaningful network. And so kind of make sure that you're always thinking about how am I building these relationships in kind of a real way. Because I think that's ultimately what it's going to take, and not just the idea of, casual networking. I think it needs to go a little bit deeper than that, at least from my experience. Um, so to talk a little bit about where I started, so I went to a really small undergraduate university in North Carolina outside of Charlotte called Wingate University. One of the really nice things about that is it was kind of this idea of, I think there were, 40 people in my Gen Chem class. Our analytical chemistry class was 12 students. By the time I finished, I graduated with 4 chemistry majors. So what that allowed you kind of to do um, is this idea of like the meaningful network. So we're really having good relationships with your professors, having good working relationships with alumni and that kind of thing. And so you start to build what that skill set looks like. And ultimately that led me to do an internship at General Dynamics. So that company does a lot of different things, but the division I worked in built handheld chemical warfare agent detectors. And so that was, a really great opportunity to get into a true R&D setting, kind of work on that problem solving mindset that we're all trying to acquire kind of in an undergraduate setting, and see what industry looked like. And so that was like a really good early opportunity for me, because this is something that I'm interested in. And scientifically it was. And then I make a joke here about having some exposure to nice but bad managers, folks that are more science oriented. And so trying to understand how do I build those relationships? How do I maybe manage up a little bit, to try and put myself in a good light, and then also, try and make it so that I'm being productive for them as kind of a team member, and what's kind of good for me is good for them, is good for the company. Um, and so that was kind of like a really nice aspect of kind of that small university feel, was that I went and did an internship with an alumni. I don't remember applying. I don't remember interviewing. I think it was kind of like I had a good relationship with the professor. They reached out, or on my behalf, and I basically got that role. And so that's kind of getting back to this idea of a networking where someone's has enough trust in you, to put their name on the line. So my undergrad advisor did that for me, and that what you'll see is that's kind of like a reoccurring theme. So I take that part really seriously. Um, and so that was like kind of like a nice point, to kind of help point me in the direction of kind of where I wanted to go next. And I just wanted to, my third bullet point there is that I think everyone can sit here and laugh at some of the ridiculous lab mates we had in undergrad. And so they may not have made it in chemistry or biology, but just take a moment to appreciate some of the laughs in those labs, with the business majors and whatnot. Hopefully there's no business majors on the line. Um, so one of the things I realized when I was working at General Dynamics is like that idea of building instrumentation is what I thought I wanted to do, right? So I picked my graduate university, based on opportunities to be in the lab, to be in labs that look kind of like the picture that I've presented here, where as soon as you get a new instrument, you take the top off, you take all the pretty things from the instrument vendor, and then you're actually under the hood working on the electronics, working on the vacuum housings, those kinds of things. So what I went in to do, was build mass spectrometers. So essentially, you're taking a sample, you're measuring the molecular weight of the compounds in that sample, to either qualify from a qualitative perspective to say what that compound is, or you might say from a quantitative perspective, you might want to say how much is there. And so that's kind of how I got started in the mass spectrometry field and the small molecule quantification that Joanne kind of hinted at. Um, and so what I'll say is I spent roughly 2.5 years trying to build instrumentation from scratch. And what I've got here is kind of my memory of that time point, is this idea of introduction to project POS. So that's probability of success. And so that bullet point goes back with kind of my ownership of the path that you take and making decisions about what you want to do next. Within that 2.5 years was a grind. Some things briefly worked, a lot of things did not work. And so what I started to realize was that I kind of needed a path forward. And so I had some side projects that were starting to gain traction. And so really starting to do a good job of trying to transition my time there, and really trying to get buy-in from my PI, and what that looks like and kind of like how I thought those projects were going to be more impactful than what we were doing, both for the lab and kind of the long term and the opportunities for success there. Um, and I think having that relationship and building that relationship and taking ownership of like, hey, I'm not doing well at this. This is something that I think could be successful for me, successful for the lab, and building that relationship, I think, is something that I would, really harp on for those of you that are in PhD programs. It's like that you and your PI need to be a really solid team and a relationship where you can kind of go back and forth and have those conversations. Um, and that you've built that kind of trust that they believe that what you're seeing is kind of, or what you're saying is going to be, kind of transpire, and that you'll be able to be successful there. Um, and then I think the other thing that I would really highlight to upcoming PhDs is this idea of building a marketable skill set, or postdocs or undergrads, whatever it is. Mass spectrometry in my scenario is something that's used in a lot of different industries, whether that be like, food industry, agriculture, pharmaceutical, which is where I ended up. Anytime you want to like say how much of a small molecule is in a sample, that becomes mass spec related. And so if you can take a tangible skill that's directly applicable to a career, that is going to be helpful. A lot of academic projects are really interesting scientifically, but if you need to find a way to be able to spin or tell your story about how what you're doing applies to a scenario in industry, if that's where you want to go, and really have that be very tangible. So if you can run a mass spectrometer, you can run a mass spectrometer, and we can put that skill set to a lot of different applications. So what in your field or what you're working on, like what is the parallel there? And I think that's really important. And I know it sounds obvious, but just continue to look for opportunities to like look into the industry and think about, whether or not your path is positioning you for kind of where you want to be long term. Um, and then I'll just finish with that last bullet point and kind of say like, when are you ready to leave? And I think this hits on a few things for me. Um, I made the joke about had career choices that I've had made for me, um, or that I've actively made. So this idea of having a relationship with my PI, and we started having conversations where we'd be standing beside each other, and someone would ask, "Oh, Brandon, when are you graduating?" And I'd look to him, and he would just blank face, right? Like very non-committal. And so what I started to do was say, "I'm going to graduate in the spring." And he never argued with me. And I think part of what he felt his job was to give me the leeway to know when I felt like I was ready, or when I had done enough and I was ready for kind of the next step. And so, trying to understand that, you're working together with them, but at the same time, depending on how that relationship goes, it's like you've got to decide what you're working on ultimately, when you're ready to get out and move on to the next thing, and like when you've done enough there. So I think that was really really important. One thing that I would say from a graduate school kind of anecdotal thing that happened for me, that gets back to this network idea. So my undergraduate advisor and alumni helped me get my internship. My internship, I really think, bolstered my application to UNC Chapel Hill, which is a really great analytical chemistry program. And then in my time as a graduate student, I had a few undergrads, but I also had a graduate student who was in our program, was younger in the program than I was, even though he had come back from industry. So he is someone who had been at GSK, wanted to go back and get their PhD to help further their career. And so I'd actually spent 2 or 3 years as the senior graduate student helping him with his project, just because that's what you did, right? You're on a team and you're trying to help all of us. You're trying to help everyone, get their PhD, get their science to work, do really interesting work. And it turned out that ultimately, right around the time that I was trying to finish up, his group had an opening. So that was kind of a natural transition into GSK, where I went from being kind of the elder statesman to being the new hire with working with that same person, which was kind of interesting. Um, at GSK, I've been in a few different groups. So I joined in 2016, and I think I was in 3 different groups within the first 3 years. Started out in dermatology, so measuring, small molecule potential drugs, trying to understand how they get into the skin or through the skin. So we had a lot of different assays set up to try and understand how the physicochemical properties of a compound end up in the dermis, the epidermis, through the skin. I can say more about skin than anyone should ever really want to hear, which was a really great opportunity. So that was kind of my first foray into this idea of drug metabolism and pharmacokinetics. So pharmacokinetics is this idea of, what does your body do to a drug once it enters it? And part of that is whether or not the drug actually gets into your body and into circulation and those kinds of things. Can it be metabolized and whatnot? And then switching groups to a very specific like research organization where we worked on oral drugs predominantly. So things that you would ingest, and then you've got to understand how the liver metabolizes them, whether or not it ends up in different tissues, different organs in the blood, how it's excreted, that kind of thing. Both of those using mass spectrometry to try and do the quantification of those compounds. And then landing in a discovery DMPK group, which is basically a centralized drug metabolism group. So now everyone that does drug metabolism pharmacokinetics is in one large 100-person organization within GSK. So all the small molecule work comes through us, and we're disease agnostic. So whatever biology is ongoing, whatever the chemistry is, as long as it's a small molecule, it will come through our group, and then specifically for my team now to say, how much drug is there, or how much biomarker, if it's, you're looking at the impact of regulation of some small molecule within the body, that comes through our group. And along the way, as you switch groups within 3 years, I think it really comes down to that networking piece again, where within my first year and a half of dermatology, built some really strong relationships, folks that were willing to put their name on the line for me to get a job within pattern recognition when that dermatology unit was shut down. And then within that transition to pattern recognition over to discovery DMPK again, making sure that I had good relationships there. And what that's allowed me to do is kind of transition from a place where I was in the lab doing the science to being in a position now where I'm leading a team. So that kind of trajectory was, I was really interested in the science, but really found that I liked the idea of helping be impactful on kind of what the direction of the group was, both scientifically and then like organizationally. And so then I started asking for development opportunities in like a more managerial perspective, right? So I was given an opportunity to have an intern here. So went from one intern to two interns to two interns, and then kind of through the course of a couple of years made that up to a couple FTEs, so full-time employees that I was managing. And then when an opportunity arose, I was able to end up leading that group. So now we have a team of 8 folks that are doing bioanalytical work within our group, and then we always have a couple students doing what we call co-ops at GSK. Other people call them internships. We don't really have a differentiation there. So again, that's kind of like this idea of really having people in your corner. So like my former manager within this group, really before she left, really made a hard big impression on my current manager that I was the right person for the role, and kind of putting her reputation on it for me. So that theme is kind of hit in multiple spots kind of along my career of kind of the long interview leads to an opportunity. A few years of taking classes gets me my internship. A few years of helping someone on their project gets me my first role. A few years of trying to do my best, for my former manager, put me in a position where she felt like I was a really strong candidate to be her successor. Each of those some of them are good, some of them are bad, but all along the way, you have to make decisions about, what do you want to work on, what's important, what's going to get you where you want to go. And then ultimately, whether you have a good manager, bad manager, you kind of have to own some of those decisions around what you're going to do and how you're going to handle that situation. So there's a lot there, and I feel like I've gone on for a few minutes. You guys didn't pop in like I was hoping you would. You let me kind of go on my soapbox, but I'll take a couple more if that's okay, Joanne, just to highlight. Um, I talked a little bit about having those co-ops or interns in our group. So I just want to take another second to kind of highlight that because that's kind of an ongoing thing for us. So over the past three plus years, I think we've had 23 students across all kinds of different universities. I've highlighted the ones in red here, where the pictures are outlined, are folks that were in their graduate programs or finishing their graduate programs and joined us. Um, and just to say that, I think this type of opportunity where you would come in and do an internship for 6 or 12 months, depending on kind of what your situation allowed, um, is a really great opportunity to kind of get your foot in the door. So, Noah down here out of Rutgers was in a stage where he was just writing. His lab work was done, and so he came and did some science with us for 6 months before he defended. And that really set him up for success. It gave him an opportunity to network here at GSK and kind of in this area. Um, and so just kind of thinking about how that might apply to some of you guys, whether or not this is something that you're interested in. We hire every quarter, essentially, right? So we have a new co-op start. We have overlapping plans. So we would have some on a January to July schedule and some of them on a March to September schedule. So this is a really great opportunity to get your foot kind of in the door. And I've highlighted a few here with gold stars. Shruti, Paul, and Elena have all come back, and when opportunities arise, not too long after they did their internships, they got into some full-time roles. So top left, Shruti in the Virginia Tech team is here in the bioanalytical team doing small molecule quantitation. Paul is doing some IT related work, and then Elena in the bottom right is doing drug metabolism in vitro based assays. And just as an opportunity, I'm not going to read through this. This is kind of just an idea around the that we don't have them just cranking a handle to turn out samples and turn out data. I know that especially for PhDs or postdocs, you want to be in a position where you're kind of doing interesting science. And so what we've done is the students that have stayed longer past their 6 months or who've done a really great job, or they've been farther in their scientific career and are able to contribute, have worked on projects that are impactful for us at kind of like a department level wide um, opportunities, right? So you actually get some skills, get some actual experience, either leading matrix teams or being involved with matrix teams across groups, and doing some interesting science, not just kind of the ho hum that we might have, someone coming out of their freshman year and doing. And again, it's just kind of the same idea where Elena, Paul, and Shruti have all joined GSK coming out of those co-op opportunities. We've had 5 folks that ended up in graduate programs, and then others hired into industry roles here in the bottom right. And I will highlight the orange star in the bottom left. Jose was kind of a full circle moment for me. So he actually came from my undergraduate. The same advisor reached out to me and said, "Hey, we have a great student. Is there anything you've got going on?" So we interviewed him. He was great. He stayed for a year, and then he is actually at UNC Chapel Hill in the same analytical program that I was in. So it's like a really cool kind of full circle opportunity, and another example of that networking where someone actually cares about you as a person. You've done a really great job, or you've been a good teammate, comes into play, because I specifically wrote his recommendation letter and then reached out to some of the professors on the board that I know read those, to make sure that he got his name was at least considered, based on his background. But I was willing to do that just based on the relationship that we had. And so what I'll do is I'll come back to the first slide, because maybe that's the one that is most pertinent for questions, if any popped up, Joanne. And I will take a pause and take a sip of water in case anybody wants to ask about anything.
Yeah, while you do that, just to highlight for folks who are finishing up their PhD and you're getting your dissertations and papers are sort of your last things, consider going on filing fee and being able to just simply finish up those paperwork, those writing aspects while doing your internship here. There was a question from Mina asking if internships are open to postdocs as well, just to more broadly address this. Postdocs are typically considered as an employee, so you most likely have to leave your postdoc to pursue the internship. I had typoed that. So that's me, but that's going to be a dynamic with you and your PI to see if there's any sort of way to work that out.
The other thing I'll add there from a GSK perspective is that you have to be within 1 year of finishing your academic career. So if you've done a postdoc for a couple of years, I think you're kind of outside the scope for these particular roles as well.
That's really good to know. Another question following up before we get to the hand raise, is this open to international students or what's sort of the restrictions there for applying?
Yep. So I won't say that I'm an expert on this. What I'm learning more about it. One example that I could give was INSEA, who was one of the PhD programs. So um, what I believe she did, so she stayed on technically as a student, and that ate into the time that she would have from that perspective. We actually offered her to come back afterwards for another 6 months, or to extend her stay for another 6 months. But what I understood from her, from a legal perspective, was when she finished her PhD, she had 1 year um, to stay within the United States before having to take the next step paperwork wise, and so that would have shortened her ability. She basically only had like one opportunity for that. It's open. We'd have to figure out the logistics on kind of how that works, but I think your sponsorship or however you're here in the United States would be based on your continuation of your PhD program, not about the GSK role. If that, I think that last sentence is probably the sentence that actually answers the question.
Excellent. Um, Hand raised from Shannon. Did you want to unmute yourself, Shannon?
Yeah. So you spend a lot of time emphasizing the importance of a network,
Yep.
but you don't spend a lot of time addressing the actual building of that kind of network. Because I know UCI, at least with chemistry, there's a lot of grad students who come in that don't have a network as a result
Mhm.
of their previous life experience, at least not one in chemistry. And so then building a network that is more than just surface deep becomes
Mhm.
a challenge in and of itself. So I was wondering if you had thoughts on that.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things that come to mind in a couple examples. So one of them is to remember that the people around you are super valuable network, right? So if you're coming in, you're going to have people that are 3 or 4, 5 years ahead of you, depending on the program. If you are at the end of your program, you've got people that are out and hopefully in industrial positions, right? Um, and for me, and it's not just about what they potentially could be hiring as the folks that you know, but it's this multiple layer of, if I had a role that I was hiring for and I know someone who knows someone, right? And if I trust the first person and then I feel like they trust the second person, that is so valuable to me. The idea of hiring someone cold is such a high barrier to entry. It's very challenging to know what you're getting. And so use the resources of the students that you've known within your department, across departments that you've worked with on projects, and kind of keep track of where those folks are. Like, friend them on LinkedIn, and it sounds silly, but then when you go to job hunt, make sure that you think about, or you take advantage of where those folks are. The other one would be kind of that local community, if there is one within your field. So within RTP, the Research Triangle Park, in where Chapel Hill is located, there was a mass spec community, right? So the idea of, you had all the students from the graduate programs, but then a lot of the folks in the industry would come out, and once a month we'd have a local talk. And that's kind of an opportunity for folks to stand around and eat pizza, but then you actually get to talk to folks, and build those relationships. And it's can be painful. Like, I'm not inherently extroverted, right? I might be loud, which is different than being extroverted. Um, but those types of opportunities where you like where you see them on a monthly basis, and kind of they can track how your career is progressing or how your academic career is progressing, so that they can give advice or reach out to folks that they might know. Um, I imagine most industries are kind of like pharma, where if you know someone at GSK, the number of connections it takes you to get from GSK to AbbVie or GSK to AstraZeneca is roughly 1 or 2. Everyone has kind of, a lot of folks have bopped around or know someone at one of them. So I think that's how I would think about it, is take advantage of the opportunities around you and be a good lab mate, be a good teammate, and I think hopefully those things pay off for you. Thanks, Shannon. Hopefully that and gets to the point of what you're asking.
Yes, thank you.
I love that, being able to demonstrate through your experience and your own relationship. Can you actually depend on them? Can you, you know, follow up on your word when you do things? So
I've been on the other side of that. Like, I know people that have asked me to put in a name for their name in a job, and I was not willing to do that. And it makes you feel like a bad person. But it's like, if you've got to, that's a very real thing, as horrible as that sounds. If they got the job on their own merit, that's one thing, but I was not willing to put, what I've tried to build um, into that for them. But there's other people, like I mentioned, Jose, or other people that I know here, that I would do it in a heartbeat for. Like, absolutely, I'll send the email to the manager. I'll have a coffee chat with the manager, whatever it takes, whatever is helpful, that I would do that for.
yeah, definitely the power of network. I have another question, which is from someone who DM'd me. Let me scroll up. Other than internships, what are you recommending for being able to get your foot into a company, or getting to learn a specific team and research group that you would like to apply for?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched on it a little bit, is like, folks do like to talk about their science. So if you can find, if there's a role that you're interested in, um, trying to see whether or not you can connect your network to get to that role or that company, because a lot of times, like, people might not work in a specific department, but they know about that department. They know the culture of the department. They know about the company. So, if one of you guys said, hey, down the line, you go, hey, Brandon, you add me on LinkedIn. You're like, hey, I'm looking at this other group. Would you mind chatting with me before I go into this interview? Like, I think that's something that this type of opportunity can kind of build or take advantage of, from that perspective. As far as getting in your foot in the door within an industry, I think, moving on from the networking aspect, I think that kind of gets back to this idea of a marketable skill set, right? Building your resume in a way that highlights the tangible skill set that the job might be asking for, or how you're going to apply, or connecting the dots for that manager of, you might have skill set A, but they might need you to know skill set B. How are you going to connect those dots, or how to make that happen? And so, kind of understanding where your skill set is in relation to the job description. Is it directly what the job is? Like, let's make sure we put it in big bold letters at the top. And if not, you've got to kind of convince someone very quickly that they could envision that they could teach you the thing they need you to know. And I think that's part of it. I mean, when we have jobs been open in the past, I would say, the amount of resumes that come in is not so overwhelming that I'm not actively looking at them all that make it past the screener. So if you've got the right keywords, like, I'm gonna see it. And so making it very easy for me to go, okay, this person has their stuff together. It looks like they've taken time on this resume. It looks very presentable. You don't have typos. You don't have like, how you do anything is how you do everything, is kind of how I view resumes. And so doing a really good job of presenting that in a way that you look like you know what you're doing, and then you got to convince me that you can either know or learn the thing that I need you to do, um, if that makes sense. I think there was 3 parts of that. I hopefully hit all 3.
I think you did, yes. There's another question here along the lines of, with the internship, what does a typical internship look like? Is it similar to PhD work? I know you shared a little bit about, it's not just grunt work, you're really evaluating the questions.
Yeah, so an opportunity. So our co-ops typically, or internships, within our department. So they're GSK wide. So if what we do doesn't interest you, they all come from the same link. You can search for keywords. So, like, and I can make sure that Joanne has that link if you want it. Within our group, it's a little bit specific, right? So it's like 6 months. If you're doing a good job, 3 months in, we basically ask, hey, do you want to stay for a year? It's really helpful for us to have you have that level of experience and be a productive member of the team, if you're getting along with the team, that kind of thing. Within Within the DMPK group, we typically have 4 students at a time. 2 of them are in a more bioanalytical role, so you're learning how to use a mass spectrometer. If so, that's like a new tangible skill set that, like I mentioned, you can go and use somewhere else. Um, and as addition to that, oftentimes what we're trying to do is improve those workflows, whether it be from like a software automation perspective where we're building systems to push data through from experiment, inception to the mass spectrometer to a database or to a data analysis system. So you're helping build those workflows, or you're more in the lab doing, lab-based workflows. So one of the things that we're doing right now, and one of our students is doing, is this idea of we've got a mass spectrometer with 2 liquid chromatography systems essentially hooked to it. And so you can alternate between those 2, but you've got to get the timing just right. And so that's like a workflow that we haven't built. So that's an opportunity for you to kind of do something new, or try and improve and figure out how to improve the chromatography in that scenario to get from we do an injection of a sample every 60 seconds to every 30 seconds. Can we do 20 seconds? What do we need to change to kind of do that? So in our group, you're learning how to use those instruments. If you're good at that, then you're learning how to improve our workflows around that instrumentation. In the in vitro group, what you might do is more cell-based assays that are around drug metabolism. So you're culturing cells, you're doing assays that determine how that drug is cleared, how much of it is metabolized, what tissues that drug might bind to more or less, and working kind of to get that data back to the project team to understand like kind of how to interpret that data and use that data. So both roles are lab based. It's just whether or not you're performing the cell based assay or doing the drug quantitation for those. I think the other aspect of this is the idea of having like an 80/20 90/10 rule. So there are always a ton of opportunities within GSK to go to seminars, external speakers, internal speakers, poster sessions. We try to do a really good job of giving our students opportunities to do that, especially those that are a little bit further in their career, where they're looking to build those relationships, kind of see what the industry holds. What aspects might they want to get interested in if what we're doing is not exactly what they want to do. And so trying to give them leeway to continue to do that. So scientifically interesting or workflow interesting where you're having to build a hard skill set of using instrumentation or building workflows. The soft skill set of working with people that are different than yourself. I remember in graduate school when I looked around, everybody was within plus or minus 3 years of me and all came from similar backgrounds or similar enough backgrounds where we did well in undergrad, we're in graduate school, we got into a good university, and so learning how to work with people that are very different from you was something that was I specifically had to do a little bit more of. And so you get an opportunity to do that, how to be involved with teams of folks that have maybe competing interests, so some of the soft skill stuff, and then also the networking or the learning about industry, this particular industry. You might find that this is not what you want to do. Like we had a student who thought she wanted to do research, was doing research, realized that we're very early in that research. We're like 8 years from a human finding the compound, taking the compound that we're working on, and 12 years from a patient who's in need, or 10 years from a patient who's in need. And that wasn't cut out for her. She actually is in the process of trying to get into med schools. She's got her interviews, I think, this month or last month. It helps you kind of find that direction that you're looking for.
Excellent. Thank you. I think we have a question from Israel. Did you want to unmute, Israel?
Yeah. Hi, Brandon. Thank you so much. That's such an amazing seminar. It's really nice to hear about your going through undergrad, through grad school, and now being in industry. You kind of touched upon this point on how to bolster your resume so that when people are screening it, you stand out. I'm currently trying to apply for jobs, and I'm noticing that there are some skills that some job posts require that I may not have. So how do you suggest I show myself as a quick learner and not just be vetted out within the first round of screening just because I don't have a certain skill?
Yeah. It's so what I would ask is that the core competency that they're looking for, right? And maybe I'll tailor my answer to whether or not that you think that is, Israel. Like, are you applying to a job where it's like that's the thing they need you to do? Like in my group, can you run a mass spectrometer? And you're like, no. Okay, then my answer might be a little bit different than a yes,
Yeah.
right?
Of course. Yeah, that makes
So that's
sense.
no,
So
so that's
not
an
until
actual
like,
question. So in your scenario, like,
sure.
what are you finding? Like, what
It's
are you
more
feeling
like
like?
an additional skill. It's not the main requirement. It's more like we would like you to know also how to do this.
Don't worry about it.
Okay,
And hopefully that's an honest answer from my instinct.
sure.
Is like, if you have the key concept of that, like
Mhm.
the main thing that they're looking for, I think that is the driver for most interviews that I have seen or that I've been involved with. This is not a job market from my experience right now where it's, things are always changing. So inundated with lots of folks that have a tremendous amount of experience that they're not going to look for that core thing. The flip side of that is, if you want to be in a position to succeed. So they might be looking for someone who's a little bit more green. Maybe their organization is a little bit top heavy and they need someone to come in and be a little bit more mentored, or have a specific skill set and then develop into that. Like, maybe that's okay. Like, if you can do that skill within the first year of you being there, that might be a success for them. As long as you're a good teammate, you pick up the things that they ask you to do, and that's what's important. As far as like being a quick learner and that kind of thing, I think when you get into if you get into an interview scenario, and they ask you about that, like, kind of be prepared for that, of like, an opportunity where you were kind of given the reins on something that you didn't really understand, and so you spent time learning about it or asking questions or going to a conference and really figuring it out, and demonstrate an example of it rather than having it in your resume say that you're a quick learner, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it definitely does. Yeah, that's definitely really helpful because I feel like there's a lot of other soft skills or transferable skills that you can easily highlight in a resume, but like being a quick learner is one of those harder ones that you kind of have to actually talk about. You can't just write about it.
No, exactly. But I wouldn't hesitate to put your name in the hat for something if you're worried
Sure.
about like the third skill on the list, right?
Mhm.
You get into an interview and you know the first one in and out, and you do a great job of communicating and walking those scenarios. That's gonna probably outweigh the idea that the third one is something they're gonna have to teach you for 3 months, right? Like, we have students come in who are in their undergraduate program and then are able to learn how to use a mass spec and do everything that we need them to do to keep the lights on within the first 4 or 5 weeks. And so you, as someone who's in a PhD program who's going to have lots of experience, the idea is like, you're going to learn if it's something they need you to do within the first couple months, and that's probably okay.
Okay. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
But if nobody calls you back, then everything I said was a lie, and I apologize, and maybe we can revisit that. I don't come up with other ideas.
Sounds good. Thank you. I'll let you know how it goes.
Yeah, let me know.
We have it in recording. You're not going to be able to escape this anymore.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely I'm on the hook. And I think you probably like linked my LinkedIn too. So.
I did. I have one last question that was sort of running in the background, and we'll give some times for folk who want to do like one-on-ones with you at the end. So this one is about having just mass spec experience, and if that's the only sort of quality that's critical to getting the jobs in this particular intern. I know you listed some other things, but what is sort of your opinion on folks who are using this in a different field, from like that's not been in pharma? Is that an issue, or what are some other ways to be able to bolster that?
So let me make sure that I'm gonna read it back. I'm gonna say it back to you, Joanne, just to make sure that I'm you heard it the same way that I did, or maybe the person come off mute if they have a second. What would they need to do to bolster their resume from a co-op or an internship perspective, and whether or not that's like mass spec or mass spec related, or if there's anything else? Is that kind of how you read that?
Yeah.
I will be perfectly honest. So this list of folks, without calling out names, is everyone that we've had in our DMPK group. Some of these had just finished their first 6 months of undergrad, and some of them had just finished, their 5th year of their PhD program. We are not necessarily looking for the skill set for you to know what we are doing here. We're looking for someone who's going to come in, be, a really great learner, be really scientifically curious, want to learn about what we're doing, be really proactive in a, EQ within the group and be able to read the room. And we can teach you the tangible skill sets that get you through the day to day of what we're asking you to do. Now, if you want to take that and run with it and apply that more, then that's because that's kind of where you are in your career trajectory. Like if you already know some mass spec, or you do a really great job within those first 6 months, and you want to do something that's more scientifically invigorating, after you've gotten your feet wet, like I think that is totally within scope, and that's something that we would come up with. But for something like this, the bar to entry is more about who you are as a person than it is about what you know coming in. And then once you're in the door, then we'll figure out to make sure that it's challenging and interesting for you scientifically, if that kind of answers it.
Yeah, that's a big highlight on a lot of sort of the roles for internships and co-ops. They're really looking for that curiosity. They're looking for, can I train this person for this particular type of role, for them to sort of learn and be able to have that. So that's really great to be able to highlight. We do have a, go ahead.
I'm sorry, and just being a really great and open learner. When I look at this list, the folks that I see on the screen, like some of them are tremendous at that and really humble and really excited. And the ones that I think about that didn't have as successful as a tenure here were ones that were quick to feel like they knew what was going on, or that they knew best. And those are few and far between, but I can still, 4 years later, spot who was who, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know we have a couple more, but we do have time at the end. I'm going to go ahead and close out the main session and let these folks ask their question individually on the back end if you're available to stay for a few more minutes, Brandon. But please, guys, go ahead and get connected with Brandon on LinkedIn. You can follow up with all these things. But everyone, please give a round of applause to Brandon and thank him for his time today. And feel free to stay back if you have your one-on-one questions.